It was the first night of my spring break, a time I had been eagerly anticipating for weeks. The stress of exams and assignments had been weighing heavily on me, and I was ready for a change of pace. When my dad suggested we go tent camping in East Texas, I jumped at the opportunity. Despite not being an avid camper, I had only been twice before. The idea of spending time in nature, away from the constant buzz of technology and the pressures of daily life, seemed like exactly what I needed. As we packed for our trip, I made sure to bring along my trusty machete. It wasn't that I expected trouble, but there was something reassuring about having it with me. Perhaps it was a remnant of childhood fantasies of adventure, or maybe just a practical precaution. Either way, its presence made me feel a little more secure as we ventured into the wilderness. The drive to our campsite was filled with the kind of easy conversation that only seems to happen on road trips. My dad and I caught up on each other's lives, shared jokes, and speculated about what our camping adventure might bring. As the urban landscape gave way to rolling hills and dense forests, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension building within me. We arrived at our chosen campsite in the late afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sound of birdsong filled the air. We set about the task of setting up our tent, a process that involved more laughter and mishaps than I care to admit. My dad's insistence that he didn't need to read the instructions led to a comically lopsided structure that we eventually managed to correct. With our shelter for the night established, we gathered firewood and set about building a campfire. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we sat around the crackling flames, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. My dad regaled me with tales of his own camping adventures from his youth, some of which I suspected were slightly embellished for dramatic effect. As night fell, the forest around us came alive with new sounds. The chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl created a soothing, natural symphony. We doused the fire and retreated to our tent, the excitement of the day giving way to a deep sense of contentment and relaxation. I drifted off to sleep easily, lulled by the gentle rustling of leaves in the night breeze. However, my peaceful slumber was destined to be short-lived. I was jolted awake at 12:30 a.m. by the sound of frantic barking. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was raising an almighty ruckus. At first, I was simply annoyed. We had come out here for peace and quiet, after all, and this cacophony was the last thing I wanted to hear in the middle of the night. As I lay there, trying to will myself back to sleep, I became aware of a throbbing pain in my head. It started as a dull ache, but quickly intensified into one of the worst headaches I've ever experienced. The pain seemed to pulse in time with the dog's barks, each sound sending a fresh wave of discomfort through my skull. After a few minutes of this torment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Apart from the dog's incessant barking, the forest had fallen completely silent. Gone were the ambient sounds of insects and nocturnal animals that had lulled me to sleep earlier. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. Despite my limited camping experience, alarm bells started ringing in my head. I remembered reading somewhere that sudden silence in nature often indicated the presence of a predator. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself straining my ears, trying to detect any sound beyond the dog's barks. Just as I was considering waking my dad to share my concerns, a new sound cut through the night. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a bizarre, chilling shriek that seemed to be an impossible blend of a mountain lion's roar, a woman's scream, and a horse's whinny. The sound reverberated through the forest, setting my nerves on edge. The unearthly cry repeated several times, each iteration sending fresh waves of fear coursing through me. I turned to my dad, desperate for reassurance or guidance, only to find him sit up groggily, mumble something incoherent, and promptly pass out again. I cursed silently, regretting not having protested more strongly when he cracked open his fourth beer earlier in the evening. After about 20 seconds that felt like an eternity, the strange shrieking finally ceased. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the sound itself. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just heard. I told myself it couldn't have been a mountain lion. I had heard those on my previous camping trip, and while their cries were unsettling, they were nothing like this unnatural sound. Despite my racing thoughts and pounding headache, exhaustion eventually won out, and I managed to fall into a fitful sleep. However, my respite was short-lived. At 3:15 a.m., I was once again jolted awake, this time by the sound of a rooster crowing. In my groggy, pain-addled state, my first reaction was one of sheer irritation. Who brings a rooster camping? The absurdity of the situation might have been amusing if not for the fact that my headache had intensified to an almost unbearable level. As I lay there, hands pressed to my temples in a futile attempt to alleviate the pain, another bizarre sound reached my ears. At first I was certain it was a donkey braying, an odd enough sound to hear in the middle of a forest. But as I listened, the sound changed, morphing into something far more disturbing. The braying deepened, taking on a guttural quality that reminded me of a heavy smoker gasping for breath. The combination of pain, confusion, and fear left me feeling disoriented and struggling to think clearly. I knew I needed to do something. Find some pain relief, wake my dad, anything, but my thoughts were too scattered to form a coherent plan. Finally, driven by a pressing need to relieve myself and a desperate hope of finding the Advil I had packed, I made the decision to leave the relative safety of the tent. In retrospect, it was probably not the wisest choice, but at the time, it seemed like my only option. As I stumbled out of the tent, I was immediately struck by how strange the environment felt. A light drizzle was falling, but it was unlike any rain I had ever experienced. The droplets felt thick and heavy, and there was a distinct metallic smell in the air. I glanced up at the sky, confused by the fact that I could clearly see the moon peeking out from behind the clouds. How could it be raining when the sky was partially clear? Shaking off my confusion, I made my way to a nearby tree to relieve myself. As I stood there, I heard a rustling sound coming from the direction where I had earlier heard the demented donkey-like noises. Every instinct told me to run back to the tent, but curiosity, or perhaps some morbid fascination, kept me rooted to the spot. I turned slowly towards the sound, and that's when I noticed something on the ground that made my stomach churn. In the bright moonlight, I could clearly see what appeared to be a pile of rotten raw deer meat. The sight and smell were revolting, and I found myself fighting the urge to vomit. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, movement at the edge of the tree line caught my eye. Something was emerging from the bushes, and as it stumbled into view, I felt a wave of terror wash over me unlike anything I had ever experienced before. At first glance, I thought I was looking at a man, but as my eyes adjusted and I took in more details, I realized how terribly wrong that assumption was. The creature before me was humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its skin was a sickly, pale gray color that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The face was a nightmare. Sunken, empty eye sockets stared blankly ahead, and where a nose should have been, there was only a smooth expanse of skin. The mouth was a jagged gash, lipless and filled with what looked like sharp, uneven teeth. The creature moved with an unnatural, jerky gait, limping as though every step caused it pain. Despite its clearly inhuman appearance, there was something almost pitiful about its labored movements. To my immense relief, the creature didn't seem to notice me. It shuffled past, its attention focused solely on the pile of rotten meat on the ground. I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, as the thing bent down in a motion that seemed to defy the normal limitations of the human spine. Its entire body folded nearly in half as it lowered its face to the meat. What followed was one of the most horrifying things I've ever witnessed. The creature began to eat, tearing into the rancid flesh with a ferocity that was both terrifying and somehow sad. The sounds of its feeding, the tearing of meat, the gnashing of teeth, and a low, guttural growling will haunt me for years to come. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear and morbid fascination. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of this impossible situation. Finally, having consumed every last scrap of the fetid meat, the creature straightened up. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it might turn and see me. Instead, it simply turned and limped back the way it had come, disappearing into the tree line as silently as it had appeared. In the aftermath of this encounter, I found myself in a state of shock. The fear I had felt earlier was replaced by a sort of numb disbelief. My mind struggled to reconcile what I had just witnessed with my understanding of reality. Zombies, monsters, creatures of myth, these things didn't exist in the real world. And yet, I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wondered if I was dreaming, if the combination of unfamiliar surroundings, my pounding headache, and perhaps some bad campfire food had resulted in an incredibly vivid nightmare. But the chill of the night air on my skin, the lingering metallic scent of the strange rain, and the vivid memory of what I had just witnessed all spoke to the reality of the experience. This was no dream or hallucination. As the initial shock began to wear off, I found myself grappling with a multitude of questions. What was that creature? Where did it come from? Were there more of them out there in the forest? And perhaps most pressingly, what should I do now? My first instinct was to wake my dad and tell him everything, but I hesitated. Would he believe me? And even if he did, what could we do? We were miles from civilization, with only a tent and some basic camping supplies to protect us. The thought of that creature, or others like it, lurking in the darkness around us was terrifying. But the idea of trying to navigate the unfamiliar forest in the middle of the night seemed equally dangerous. In the end, driven by a combination of fear, confusion, and an overwhelming need for some kind of normalcy, I made my way back to the tent. My dad was still sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded just yards away. Part of me envied his peaceful slumber, while another part resented him for not being awake to share in this burden. As I lay there in the darkness, every rustle of leaves and crack of a twig outside sending fresh waves of panic through me, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The creature defied any logical explanation I could come up with. It wasn't human, that much was certain, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever seen or heard of either. I found myself thinking back to all the horror movies I'd watched, all the scary stories I'd read. None of them had prepared me for the reality of coming face to face with something truly unexplainable. The creature I had seen wasn't some CGI monster or an actor in makeup. It was real, tangible, and utterly terrifying. As the night wore on and no further sounds or sightings occurred, I began to wonder if perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. Could stress, lack of sleep, and an overactive imagination have combined to create this vivid hallucination? But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gray, noseless face, those empty eye sockets, and I knew that what I had witnessed was all too real. When dawn finally broke, I was still wide awake, my mind racing with the events of the night. As sunlight filtered through the tent walls, I felt a measure of relief. Somehow, the terrors of the night seemed less threatening in the light of day. My dad woke up, groggy and nursing a hangover from his overindulgence the night before. As he stumbled out of the tent to make coffee, I was struck by the normalcy of it all. How could I explain to him what had happened? How could I put into words the terror and confusion I had experienced? In the end, I said nothing. We packed up our campsite and headed home, my dad none the wiser about the events that had transpired while he slept. As we drove away from the forest, I found myself constantly looking back, half expecting to see a gray figure limping out of the trees. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what I'd seen. I scoured the internet for any reports of similar sightings in the area, but found nothing conclusive. I considered reporting my experience to the local authorities, but feared they would dismiss me as a prankster or worse, someone in need of psychological help. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself more cautious, more aware of the shadows at the edge of my vision. I've developed a newfound respect for the unknown and a keen awareness that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we often allow ourselves to believe. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I saw that night in the East Texas forest. Was it some unknown species, a supernatural entity, or something else entirely? These questions continue to haunt me, keeping me awake on dark nights when the memory of that creature's empty eyes and grotesque feeding frenzy comes flooding back. One thing I know for certain, I'll never look at the world quite the same way again. The veil of normalcy that we drape over our daily lives has been irreparably torn for me, revealing glimpses of a reality far more complex and terrifying than I ever imagined. As I sit here recounting this story, I can't help but wonder, what else is out there, lurking in the shadows of our world? And more importantly, are we ready to face it when it finally steps into the light? As I continue to reflect on that fateful night, I find myself delving deeper into the implications of what I witnessed. The experience has sparked a newfound curiosity about the unknown, leading me down paths I never thought I'd explore. In the months following our camping trip, I became somewhat obsessed with researching cryptozoology and folklore. I spent countless hours poring over books and online forums, searching for any accounts that might bear similarities to my encounter. While I found many stories of strange creatures and unexplained phenomena, none quite matched what I had seen. My academic interests shifted as well. I'd always been a science-minded person, but now I found myself drawn to subjects like anthropology, mythology, and even quantum physics. I was searching for answers, for some framework that could help me make sense of my experience. This quest for understanding has not been without its challenges. I've had to be careful about who I share my story with. Most people react with skepticism or outright disbelief. Some friends have suggested that I might have been hallucinating, or that my memory of the event has been distorted over time. While I understand their skepticism, I know in my heart that what I saw was real. The strain of carrying this secret has taken its toll on my relationships. I've become more withdrawn, finding it difficult to engage in trivial conversations when my mind is preoccupied with questions about the nature of reality. My dad has noticed the change in me, and I can see the concern in his eyes. Sometimes I consider telling him about that night, but I always stop short, fearing that it might create a rift between us. Despite the challenges, my experience has also brought some positive changes to my life. I've developed a deeper appreciation for the natural world and the mysteries it holds. I find myself spending more time outdoors, observing the intricate patterns of life around me with a newfound sense of wonder. Every rustling leaf and animal call holds the potential for discovery. I've also become more open-minded about other people's experiences with the unexplained. Where once I might have dismissed accounts of paranormal encounters, I now listen with empathy and genuine interest. I've connected with a community of like-minded individuals online, people who have had their own brushes with the unknown. While our experiences may differ, we share a common understanding of how such encounters can reshape one's worldview. As time passes, I find myself grappling with a dilemma. Part of me wants to return to that forest in East Texas, to search for evidence that might corroborate my experience. I've even gone so far as to plan solo camping trips, mapping out the area and preparing supplies. But each time I'm on the verge of setting out, a deep-seated fear holds me back. What if I encounter that creature again? Or worse, what if I find nothing at all, casting doubt on the veracity of my memories? The impact of that night extends beyond my personal life. It has made me question larger issues about our place in the universe. If such creatures exist, undetected by mainstream science, what else might be out there? Are there entire ecosystems or even civilizations existing alongside us, just beyond the veil of our perception? These thoughts have led me to explore philosophy and spirituality, seeking wisdom from various traditions about the nature of reality and consciousness. I've also become more aware of environmental issues. The thought that there might be unknown species living in our forests has made me passionate about conservation efforts. I've joined local environmental groups, and participated in initiatives to protect natural habitats. In a way, I feel a sense of responsibility to preserve these wild spaces, not just for known species, but for the mysteries they might harbor. As I write this, I'm struck by how much that single night has shaped the course of my life. It's as if my world has been split into two distinct periods, before and after the encounter. While the experience was terrifying and the lingering questions often leave me feeling unsettled, I can't help but feel that my life has been enriched by this glimpse into the unknown. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I saw that night. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, serving as a reminder of how much we have yet to learn about our world. But I do know that I'll continue searching for answers, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the hidden wonders and terrors that might exist just beyond the edge of our understanding. As I look to the future, I'm filled with a mix of apprehension and excitement. Will I have another encounter with the unexplained? Will I find evidence that supports what I saw? Or will I discover a rational explanation that puts my questions to rest? Only time will tell. For now, I'll continue to straddle the line between skeptic and believer, between the world as we know it and the vast unknown that lies beyond. And whenever I find myself in nature, whether it's a sprawling forest or a simple city park, I'll always keep one eye on the shadows, wondering what secrets they might hold. To those who read my story, I offer this advice: keep an open mind. The world is far stranger and more wonderful than we often allow ourselves to believe. And who knows, your own brush with the unknown might be just around the corner, waiting to change your life as profoundly as that night in East Texas changed mine. As the years passed, my experience in that East Texas forest continued to shape my life in unexpected ways. I found myself drawn to a career in wildlife biology, specializing in the study of nocturnal creatures. This path allowed me to spend countless nights in forests around the world, always with one eye open for anything out of the ordinary. My colleagues often remarked on my exceptional patience and attention to detail during night observations. Little did they know that every rustle in the undergrowth, every unexplained shadow, sent my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Was this the night I would see that creature again? Or perhaps discover something equally inexplicable? As my reputation in the field grew, I began to receive emails and letters from people around the world who had their own strange encounters to share. Many of these stories were easily dismissible, obvious hoaxes or misidentifications of known animals, but a few stood out. They described creatures that defied conventional categorization, beings that seemed to exist in the liminal spaces between our understanding of reality and something else entirely. I started keeping a private journal of these accounts, cross-referencing them with historical folklore and cryptozoological reports. Patterns began to emerge: clusters of sightings in certain geographic areas, similarities in the descriptions of creatures from widely separated regions. It was like assembling a vast global puzzle with pieces scattered across time and space. One day, about 5 years after my original encounter, I received an email that made my blood run cold. It was from a fellow researcher in Romania, describing a creature he had glimpsed in the Carpathian Mountains. The details matched almost exactly with what I'd seen in Texas. The gray skin, the noseless face, the unnatural gait. For the first time, I had corroboration from a credible source. This discovery reignited my determination to find answers. I applied for a research grant to study undocumented nocturnal species in areas with high concentrations of unusual sightings. To my surprise, the grant was approved, perhaps due to my growing reputation in the field. And so began a new chapter in my life, one of global travel and intensive field research. I spent months in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, the remote highlands of Scotland, the steamy jungles of the Amazon. Each location brought new challenges, new mysteries, and occasionally new glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. I never again had an encounter as clear and prolonged as that night in Texas. But there were moments. A flash of gray skin in the moonlight, the echo of an unnatural cry in the darkness that convinced me I was on the right track. These beings, whatever they were, seemed to exist on the very edge of human perception, visible only in fleeting moments when the veil between worlds grew thin. My research began to attract attention, both positive and negative. Some colleagues were intrigued by my findings, seeing the potential for groundbreaking discoveries. Others dismissed my work as pseudoscience, damaging to the reputation of our field. I found myself straddling the line between mainstream academia and the fringe world of cryptozoology, never fully accepted by either. The strain of this dual life began to take its toll. Relationships suffered as I spent more and more time in the field. My father, once my closest confidant, grew distant, unable to understand my obsession. There were nights when I lay awake in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest and wondered if I was chasing ghosts, if that creature in Texas had been nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination that had spiraled into a life-consuming quest. But just when doubt would threaten to overwhelm me, something would happen to reaffirm my conviction. A new sighting report that aligned perfectly with my own experience. A strange footprint that defied identification. A local legend that echoed details I had never made public. As I approached the 10th anniversary of that fateful night, I find myself at a crossroads. My research has yielded a wealth of data, but nothing conclusive enough to satisfy the scientific community. I have volumes of field notes, hours of audio recordings, and gigabytes of inconclusive video footage. But hard evidence of these creatures, if that's indeed what they are, continues to elude me. Part of me wants to continue the search, to dedicate the rest of my life to unraveling this mystery. Another part yearns for a return to normalcy, to accept that some questions may never be answered, and to find peace in the not knowing. Whatever path I choose, I know that my life has been irrevocably changed by what I saw that night in East Texas. It opened my eyes to the vastness of the unknown, to the possibility that our understanding of the world is far from complete. It taught me humility in the face of nature's mysteries and gave me a profound respect for the untamed corners of our world. To those who may read this account, I offer neither proof nor definitive answers. I can only share my experience and the journey it set me upon. Perhaps someday, science will shed light on the creature I encountered. Or perhaps it will remain a mystery, a reminder that there are still wonders and terrors in this world beyond our current understanding. As for me, I know that I will never look at a forest at night the same way again. In every shadow, in every unexplained sound, I will always wonder, what's out there, just beyond the reach of our flashlights? What secrets does the darkness hold? And are we ready to face the truth when it finally steps into the light? On what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I found myself asking for a divorce. It's a strange story, but a true one, and I'll tell you all the details. I was a bride in a state far from my hometown, and on my wedding day, my husband's family came to take me to the marital home. The journey was long and exhausting, taking a full 4 hours on the road. We arrived near the time of the ASR prayer, and fatigue had taken its toll on me, but I was trying to hide it behind the happy bride's smile. I entered the house amid the women's ululations and the cheers of those present. The house was crowded with guests and relatives who had come to celebrate the arrival of the new bride. I started preparing myself mentally for the moment when I would sit at the forefront of the gathering, as is customary for the bride on her wedding night. I imagined myself sitting in my beautiful white dress, surrounded by congratulating women, my heart pounding with both happiness and nervousness. But what happened next turned all my expectations upside down. My mother-in-law approached me, a woman of dignity and poise, and said to me in a firm voice, "Before you sit at the forefront, you must enter the kitchen." I looked at her in astonishment, as did my mother, who was standing beside me. My mother asked in surprise, "What will she do in the kitchen? She's a bride who has just arrived from a long journey." My mother-in-law replied in a tone that brooked no argument. "It is our tradition here that when a bride enters her husband's house for the first time, she must knead and bake 10 loaves of bread. When she finishes and the household eats from them and approves, only then can she begin to sit at the forefront of the gathering." For a moment, I thought she was joking. I laughed lightly and said, "Surely you must be joking, Aunt. I'm a bride and I've just arrived after a long and tiring journey. How can I knead and bake 10 loaves in this state?" But my mother-in-law's serious look told me she wasn't joking at all. She confirmed to me, saying, "These are our customs and traditions, and you must respect and implement them." I felt shock and anger overwhelm me. I looked at my mother with pleading eyes, and she in turn tried to mediate and convince my mother-in-law to abandon this request, but to no avail. At that moment I felt as if the world was spinning around me. How could this happen on my wedding day? How could they ask me to do such hard work when I was in full bridal attire and exhausted? In my desperation, I called my husband asking for his intervention. I was hoping he would stand by me and refuse this strange request, but his response shocked me even more as he said, "Listen to my mother and do as she says. There's no need to cause problems on the first day." I stood there bewildered, feeling insulted and angry. It wasn't the kneading itself that bothered me, as I was used to helping with housework in my parents' home. But what really hurt me was the way it was done, and its timing on a day that was supposed to be the most beautiful in my life. I tried to negotiate, saying, "Aunt, can we postpone this until tomorrow morning? If you wish, I'll prepare the entire lunch by myself tomorrow." But my mother-in-law was insistent and said firmly, "If you don't knead and bake now, your wedding won't be complete." At that moment, I felt my dignity had been trampled. I imagined myself with my perfect hairstyle and beautiful makeup, standing in front of the dough in the kitchen instead of being the center of attention among the well-wishers at the forefront of the gathering. It was more than I could bear. With tears of anger and frustration, I shouted, "Enough! Gather my things and call my father. I want to go back to our house now." Everyone looked at me in shock, but I was determined. At that moment, I decided that I couldn't continue in a marriage that started this way. I asked for a divorce, fully aware of the gravity of my decision, but I felt it was the right one. Now, after time has passed, I sometimes find myself wondering, was my decision hasty? Was the reason trivial, as some say? But I soon remember my feeling of humiliation and degradation at that moment, and I realized that the matter was bigger than just kneading bread. It was about respecting my feelings and dignity as a human being, and my right to be treated with respect, especially on my wedding day. It's true that many people blame me, saying, "If you had just done what your mother-in-law asked, everything would have been fine." But I wonder, would everything really have been fine? Or was this incident just the beginning of a series of concessions I would have had to make at the expense of my self-respect? In the end, I realized that marriage should be built on mutual respect and understanding, not on blind submission to traditions that can sometimes be unfair. Despite the difficulty of the decision, I feel that I chose to respect myself, and it's a choice I will never regret. And to you who hear my story, do you think my decision was right or was I mistaken? On the evening of May 6, 2008, a 54-year-old man named Ricky Williams was camping in the mountains and forests for several weeks with only his dog. Ricky reached the top of a mountain where there was a small river in Western Virginia, United States, on a long, well-known camping trail called the Appalachian Trail. When Ricky arrived at the river, he quickly took out his fishing rod and cast it into the water, hoping to catch any fish, even a small one. He waited patiently but couldn't catch anything. Ricky usually enjoyed fishing and didn't care much whether he caught something or not, as he enjoyed the whole experience. But on this particular day, he desperately needed to catch any fish because he had been on a camping trip for weeks with his dog, and their food had completely run out. Their last hope was for Ricky to catch any fish so they could grill and eat it. Otherwise, they would sleep hungry that night. The place where he was fishing was called Dismal Creek. Despite its gloomy name, it was a beautiful spot on top of a mountain on a well-known trail called the Appalachian Trail. This trail is famous for its stunning natural scenery and is considered a very long route, stretching over 3,500 kilometers, connecting several states in the United States. Because of its beautiful scenery, many hiking, camping, and wildlife enthusiasts come to camp there. Due to its vast and large area, few people encounter other campers, giving them a feeling of isolation and complete disconnection from the world. Ricky was fishing on the mountain on this same trail. This trail is known for a law or code among all campers there. If one sees another camper in distress or in need of help, they must go and help them. This is the law of the trail because it's an isolated and remote place, and people rarely encounter each other, so someone might be in trouble and need help. Ricky knew this law well, and although his fishing rod hadn't caught any fish, he decided to stay for about an hour, taking out the rod and recasting it into the river, hoping that some other campers would come and see him struggling and unable to catch a fish, so maybe they would help him and give him some food for him and his dog. While he was waiting patiently, either to catch a fish or for someone else to come by chance to camp in this place and help him and give him food, the sun began to set. Ricky noticed that his dog started making the sounds dogs make when they're scared, and seemed tense and anxious, as if feeling threatened or sensing the presence of a predator near the area they were in. Ricky began to calm his dog and try to reassure it, but at the same time, he started to hear a sound behind him coming from among the trees. It was the sound of something or someone approaching him. Ricky felt a kind of excitement and reassurance upon hearing the sound of footsteps, as it might be someone coming who could give him food and help him out of this predicament he was in. But at the same time, he began to feel threatened, scared, and anxious. It's important to know that Ricky, at 54 years old, wasn't very old, but he had spent weeks in this forest on a camping trip, so he looked extremely tired and was very thin because he had lost a lot of weight. He was also weak and not physically strong, so he could have been an easy victim or prey for anyone. The Appalachian Trail is known to be forests and relatively safe, meaning there aren't many incidents, crimes, or problems there. But this doesn't mean it's 100% safe, especially since about 27 years before this day, a horrific crime occurred in the same place where Ricky was now. This crime happened just 3 kilometers away from where Ricky was fishing. This crime occurred about 27 years ago in 1981. What happened that night was that a person who was a very famous criminal named Randall Lee Smith. His case became very famous at that time because he went to 2 campers and killed them in their tent after stabbing them and shooting them suddenly, knowing that he didn't know them and they didn't know him. This case, despite 27 years passing, remained etched in the minds of people who camp in this area. They remember it and talk about it. When Ricky heard the sound of the person approaching him and coming between the trees, he began to feel tense because he knew a lot about Randall's story and this crime that occurred 27 years ago. This person began to approach Ricky more, and he could hear the sound of someone talking as if to himself. And here, from among the trees, right in front of Ricky, appeared a person who seemed to be in his early 30s. In the first seconds, Ricky and this person were alert towards each other, as if each was worried about the other's presence in this place. But soon the person who appeared to Ricky started smiling and said to him, "Hello, how are you?" And everything seemed normal with him. Here Ricky relaxed a little and felt that this man posed no threat, and he seemed friendly and normal. This person introduced himself to Ricky and told him that his name was Scott Johnston, and told him that he and his friend were camping near this forest or in the forest, but near this river. He told him that he left his friend at the camp and came to fish, just like Ricky. Of course, he greeted Ricky and asked how he was and everything. Ricky here didn't answer anything except that he was fine, but he asked him directly if he had food. This was a direct question because he really desperately needed food, as he and his dog hadn't eaten for days. Of course, this man said to him, "Yes, of course I do. He took out from his backpack a bag of potato chips and 2 energy bars, which are like this chocolate that gives energy. He also gave him small fish to use as live bait while fishing, which is better than the artificial bait Ricky was using and hadn't caught anything with for the past few hours. In the following hours, Scott and Ricky sat on the edge of the river fishing together and talking. And indeed, they managed to catch more than 1 fish, and it seemed that the day that had been miserable for Ricky had taken another turn, and everything in it seemed like it would become excellent. As the sun began to set, and to make the day even better for Ricky, Scott asked Ricky if he would like to join him and his friend in their camp to grill the fish and have dinner together. Ricky, who had no food for himself and his dog, quickly agreed and said to him, "Thank you, and of course I won't refuse such an invitation." And indeed, the two began to head through the same forest that Scott had come from to go to his camp. They actually started walking in the forest, and the whole way was silent for them. Neither of them was talking to the other, and darkness had begun to fall on the forest. Their silence was broken when Scott's fishing rod got caught on one of the branches that were above them from the trees. So of course he started trying to free his rod, but it was clear that it was stuck in a complex way, and he needed to climb the tree to untangle the rod. He saw that it would take time, and he saw that Ricky was older and was tired and seemed hungry, so he said to him, "I think it's better for you to continue alone on the way to the camp. It's straight ahead of you, just get out of here. You'll only walk a few meters until you reach a hill. Once you stand on the hill, you'll see our tents and camp, me and my friend, directly at the foot of this hill. So you continue on your way alone, and I'll free the rod at my leisure and catch up with you." Here, Ricky asked, "Aren't you sure? Don't you want me to help you or do something for you?" He replied, No, I'm totally fine. You go on alone and I'm coming behind you." So indeed here, Ricky and his dog started to continue on their way alone and go to the camp. Ricky finally reached this hill and climbed it and saw the tent and started approaching it. Of course, here darkness had completely fallen, so what he saw was the flame of the fire near the tent. He started advancing towards the camp, and as he got closer to the fire and the tent, he was surprised by the scene he saw, because it was a somewhat shocking scene. What he saw in front of him was that in front of the fire sat a person, and as Ricky approached him, he saw that the size of this person was unnatural. He was unnaturally huge and was very tall and also very obese. Ricky was surprised by the sight of this person when he approached him. Of course, this person was probably Scott's friend that Scott had talked about. This huge man heard the sound of Ricky's footsteps, so he quickly turned to him and picked up a stick in his hand and started approaching him and asking him, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" You know, in a remote area like this and someone comes to it who he doesn't know, it's natural for him to feel scared or threatened by his presence. Here, Ricky quickly didn't have time to say anything and was shocked by the size of this man. So he just started raising his hands and saying to him, "I have nothing to do with anything. Scott is the one who sent me to the camp, and believe me, he's coming behind me and I don't want to hurt you and I don't pose any threat." He started telling him this, and before the huge person had time to answer him or do anything, Scott appeared from behind Ricky. Scott came and patted Ricky's shoulder and said to him, "Finally, you met my friend Sean Farmer." Here Sean quickly threw away the stick that was in his hand, and the angry features disappeared from his face, but the features of discontent remained on his face. Ricky simply saw that this Sean was not at all happy with Ricky's presence. He was upset by his presence among them. But Ricky tried not to take any reaction and act normally with him. Ricky felt that he was unwelcome by Sean, but despite that, Scott was trying very hard to lighten the atmosphere between them. He was saying to him, "Come on, Ricky, sit with us. Don't be shy. You must taste Sean's food. He's the best cook." He was trying to break the ice between them, but despite that, Sean remained silent and didn't exchange any words with Ricky. Indeed, and after insistence from Scott, Ricky sat with them, and here Sean started taking the fish and preparing them for grilling. At this time, Scott went to his truck, which was parked near Sean's Jeep, and got into his truck and started playing songs at a very loud volume. Here, Ricky was bothered by this thing, because he felt that he was escaping from the hustle of the city to feel this calm and serenity in the forest. So he felt that these loud songs were a violation of the calm and serenity of the forest. He felt that this was all disrespectful to the place, so he felt more uncomfortable. Ricky felt that there was something wrong with these two. He didn't understand exactly what it was, but there was something wrong with their behavior. But he decided to remain seated because he was, remember, hungry and hadn't eaten for days, so he wanted to have dinner with his dog and then leave. After a while, Scott joined Sean, and the two began cleaning the fish with their knives. Darkness had fallen, so they were putting their flashlight on the knives and fish and cleaning them. Ricky was sitting quietly and looking at them, and all he saw was the reflection of the lights on their knives when they raised them, and heard the sound of cutting the fish. They asked him if he needed help or anything, and when he indicated from afar that he didn't want anything, they began grilling the fish. Silence fell over the camp, so here Ricky, to break this silence, began to open topics with them and tell them how much he loves camping in this forest, and how much he considers it like his home and feels safer in it than even in his home, and that he spends weeks in it with his dog to get away from the noise in the city and from all the hustle in the city. And he told them that he loves to contemplate and pray in this forest. And he began to describe to them and praise the beauty of the forest. But he began to notice that the two were not interested. Each of them was looking at the other with a questioning look about this strange person, as if what he was saying was very strange to them. The two just started shaking their heads and seemed not at all interested in his words or that they didn't know anything about it. So here Ricky felt very embarrassed, so he decided to be silent and not open any other topic concerning him. Finally the fish was prepared, and the three began eating in silence. And when they finished and Ricky ate, he thanked them and said to them, "Thank you, and I am grateful to you, and I must go now." And indeed he took his dog and started walking and leaving the place. After walking a distance of about 4 to 5 meters, two things happened here and happened quickly. First, Ricky froze and stood in his place, and then turned to the two. And second, he heard a sound like an explosion or something like a very strong gunshot coming from the direction of the camp. About half an hour after this event that we will tell you about shortly and tell you what happened in it, it was now 8:30 p.m. The event that occurred with Ricky after he left the camp happened at 8 p.m. After half an hour, and at a distance of about 6 kilometers from Sean and Scott's camp that Ricky was leaving, there was a cabin where two ladies lived. They were living in the middle of the forest, in isolation from all people, and were sitting having dinner. And while they were having dinner, they heard a sound of knocking and banging very strongly on the door of their cabin. Here the two were shocked, because they were living alone and knew well that there were no guests coming to them, and there were no people near them. So they felt terrified, especially since the time was at night. What happened is that one of them quickly went and took the phone to call the police, while the other started sneaking and going to the window to see who this person was knocking on their door. She tried to look from the window, but she couldn't see anything because the darkness was very intense. But she started asking this person to answer her and tell her who he was. But he didn't respond to her and continued knocking on the door. Here she opened the door a little, and what she saw in front of her terrified her. What she saw was a man covered from head to toe in blood. His whole body was blood, to the degree that she described him as being all red in color. Of course, she was very terrified by his appearance, but she didn't know what to do because this man was holding his neck and seemed to be in a very bad condition. Quickly he said one word to her and then lost consciousness. This one word was Dismal Creek, meaning the camp or the place of the camp and the river where Scott and Sean and Ricky were. The important thing is that this man, after saying this word, the two women were shocked by the sight they saw in front of them and didn't know what to do, but they acted quickly and called the police and also the ambulance. While they were waiting for the police and ambulance, they noticed from afar that there was a jeep car that was parked at a close distance from their cabin, and its lights and headlights were on. So this light was preventing them from seeing who the person was who was driving it and arrived with it to the cabin, or whether there was another person who brought him there and was still in the car. They didn't know. They quickly called for an ambulance and the police, who arrived quickly at the cabin to rescue this man and understand what happened to him. The man was quickly transported by helicopter to the hospital, and it was clear that he had severe injuries to his neck and back. They asked the woman what happened, and she told them everything and said to them that the man mentioned something about Dismal Creek before he lost consciousness. And of course the police knew this place. And to understand what happened, and in the hope of finding answers quickly, the police car set off to this place. The car was facing great difficulty in driving because the road was mountainous and winding, and also the time was at night and the darkness was unnaturally intense, which made it difficult for them to move. Nevertheless, they were driving at the maximum possible speed towards this place. Lights appeared for a car, or rather for a truck that was speeding in the opposite direction to them. When the car approached the police car, this truck swerved and stopped. But then the police were surprised that the person who was driving it continued on his way and pressed the gas pedal at his maximum speed, so he took off and fell into one of the valleys on this road. The car started flipping over more than once until it stopped and fell into this valley. The police were shocked by the scene they witnessed in front of them. This person didn't have an accident. It seemed that he deliberately did this thing. This happened because his car stopped, but he again pressed the gas pedal and took off after he saw the police car. Here the police quickly got down and went to this truck and indeed found inside it one person who was the driver, and in a way that means a miracle. This driver was still alive. But they put a policeman with him to watch him. The police here had two strange events, one more puzzling than the other. First, an injured man arrives at the house of two women in a remote forest area, severely wounded, asking for help and mentioning Dismal Creek. Then, when they go there, they find a truck speeding away from the area, and its driver deliberately crashes when he sees the police. It seemed that the two events were somehow connected. After half an hour, the police finally reached an area near the river and began searching the forest, but they found nothing noteworthy until they reached the depths of the forest to a camp. This camp looked very old, dirty, and small. It wasn't Scott and Sean's camp, but a completely different one. It was a simple camp, just a dilapidated and old tent, and nearby was wood that the person living here apparently used to light fires. And as I said, living, because the camp was old, and it seemed that the person had been living in it and not just camping for short periods. The police knew from the first glance that the person who lived in the camp, or who had lived in it, was a mentally unstable person, and a disturbed person in every sense of the word. When they searched his tent, they found more than 30 knives of different sizes and shapes. They also found in his tent a scanner device for spying on police communications via radio in the area near this forest. This person, whoever he was interested in spying on the police and knowing where and what they were doing. A detailed map of this place was also found, marked with red circles on a number of places on this same trail we've been talking about throughout the story and where people camp. They also found piles of old clothes for children and women and men, all in different sizes, and many women's underwear. And a large number of prescription glasses that also belonged to different people and random items, none of which resembled the other. They were all piled up near the camp. Although it was clear that one person lived in this camp, why were all these clothes there? The police also found a recording device with a cassette tape inside, which seemed to have been recorded by someone for themselves and in their voice. When the police played, imagine that they are in the middle of this night, played this recording, whoever heard it would be haunted in their nightmares. What was recorded on the tape was something like satanic rituals, like hymns and prayers that glorify Satan. And who says it is a person screaming in a loud voice as if he is alone in the forest and as if he is repeating these hymns as a kind of satanic ritual that he practiced? The person who recorded this voice is the same person who lived in this camp or is still living in it somewhere now. and they warned that this place shocked the police the most because there is something else that shocked them and literally made them freeze in their place. Because what they saw next was shocking. Inside the tent, they found a paper. This paper was a birth certificate in the name of a person. This name is what will connect all the events that you may not have understood until now for you. I know that the subject has become complicated from the sound of the explosion that Ricky heard and Sean, and Scott in their camp, to the blood-covered man who appeared at the door of the two ladies and asked for help to the person who was driving the truck, and the police saw him on the road and his truck overturned. The name of the person that the police found in this birth certificate in the tent is what will connect all these events. Let's go back a little in time when Ricky finished eating with Scott and Sean and started leaving their camp. Here he looked at them one last look, and Sean and Scott heard a sound like an explosion. Here Sean put his hand on his head, or specifically on his face, and saw that his hand was all red. Here he looked at Ricky and was shocked that Ricky was holding a gun in his hand. Ricky, before leaving the camp, looked one last look and shot Sean. This sound like an explosion was the sound of gunfire. Ricky, a weak and elderly man, started going back towards Sean and Scott while firing at them. Of course, they tried to dodge, but failed. Sean fell to the ground because he was hit in the face, while Scott quickly fled, trying to hide in the forest. But Ricky started chasing him at full speed and shooting at him. He hit him with a bullet in his neck and a bullet in his back. And somehow, Scott continued to flee and run towards the forest. Here, when Ricky saw that Scott was injured with these injuries, he knew that he would not be able to go anywhere and knew that he would surely die on the way, so he left him and returned to Sean, who was lying on the ground. He raised his gun and shot at his chest and thought he would end his life. He stood on his feet despite being injured in his face and chest and ran to his Jeep car and got in it and drove it at his fastest speed and set off to the main road to find help. And of course, as soon as he took off, he saw Scott there, who was injured and walking on the road. So he quickly got in with him and they went quickly to the nearest house they saw on their way, which was the house of the two ladies in the forest. Here Sean was the one driving the car and couldn't get out of it, but Scott got out of the car and he was the one who knocked on the door of the two ladies, and they saw him covered in blood and quickly called the police and the ambulance, which came and didn't just take Scott to the hospital, but Sean as well, who was in the Jeep car that the ladies saw and were wondering who brought it there. As for the police, when they went to this place and saw this man who was trying to escape from them and avoid them, this man was simply Ricky Williams. He was using Scott's truck to escape from the police after what he did to these two, and thought that they might live and testify against him. But unfortunately for him, he fell into the valley and his car overturned. In fact, his name wasn't Ricky Williams. The name that the police found in the tent on this birth certificate, and by the way this camp belonged to Ricky, he was the one living in it. And not as he told Sean or Scott that he came for just a few weeks and was living in the forest. His real name that the police found on the birth certificate and literally shocked them was Randall Lee Smith. Exactly. The same killer who killed two young men in their camp, and he didn't know them in the same place 27 years ago in 1981. This person, Randall, is the same Ricky. He returned after 27 years to the same place and again attacked two people. What happened with Randall, or Ricky, is that after he carried out that crime in 1981, he was released after 15 years due to his good behavior and conduct. So they decided to release him in 1996. After that, and for 10 years, he lived a very normal life with his mother and was wearing a tracking bracelet. The police were tracking him through it. Everything was fine, and he didn't violate any laws until 2008, when he decided to take off this bracelet and take his things and his dog and set off to live in the same forest where he committed his crime 27 years ago and disappear from all sights. No one knows why Randall killed the two young men in 1981 or why he attacked Scott and Sean in 2008. No one knows other than that he was a mentally unstable person and had beliefs in satanic rituals and that he had to continuously offer human sacrifices in this forest because he believed in these strange beliefs. He saw that this forest belonged to a god and that it was his home, and that he must protect it and must live in it. And perhaps he saw that Sean and Scott's behavior had diminished respect for this forest, so he decided to attack them and end their lives. The shocking thing is that Sean and Scott were rescued and lived a very normal life, and told their story and said that as soon as they saw him they felt pity for him and thought he was homeless, so they decided to shelter him and help him. And they also saw that he was an elderly and thin man and had no physical strength, so they didn't suspect that he would pose any threat to them and didn't know that he was the same serial killer Randall Lee Smith. The tape that the police found he was recording his voice on, meaning Ricky or Randall was recording his voice for these rituals, and he was always listening to them and performing these rituals in the forest and in his camp in the middle of the night. Also the clothes that the police found. They believed they belonged to other victims. He had ended their lives and buried them in places in this forest. The map they found marked with places. The police searched in these places, but they didn't find anything strange in these places. The only person who knows who owns these clothes is Randall, and this means that we will never know who owns these clothes and whether they are indeed his victims or not, because Randall, and after only 4 days from the truck overturning, he died in the hospital, and during these 4 days nothing happened, and he didn't confess any confession to the police. We heard the whole story from Sean and Scott. Today, Sean and Scott live normally and in excellent health, and visit Dismal Creek and camp there and in the same place. But Sean lives and still has a bullet in his head and chest that they can't remove because he might die, and Scott still has traces in his back and neck. From that terrifying night they lived and meet the serial killer Randall Lee Smith. I hope you enjoyed this strange case that amazed my mind. Subscribe to the channel. Subscribe with me those who haven't subscribed yet. Write to me in the comments which things shocked you.